The city was alive but restless, caught somewhere between the quiet charm of its old streets and the cold ambition of the glass towers that rose over them. The days seemed ordinary to anyone passing through. Families rushing to school, workers spilling out of subway stations, street vendors calling out their prices. But beneath the surface, stories were waiting to break apart. Stories where chance encounters carried far more weight than they first appeared. One such encounter began on a grey autumn morning, when the light struggled to break through a low ceiling of clouds, and the air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked pavement. On a corner where the old part of town pressed against the edge of the financial district, a young man moved quickly, his jacket zipped up against the chill, his sneakers worn from use. He wasn't the kind of person most people noticed, someone with an easy smile, soft eyes, and the type of face that never pushed itself into attention. His name would eventually become known to many, though for now, he was just another figure among thousands. What made him stand out wasn't money or influence, but something quieter, a habit of paying attention when others didn't. That morning, it was a detail most would have passed over, something small enough to vanish in the noise of the street. An old man sat by the curb, his hands resting on the arms of a wheelchair that had clearly seen better years. The frame was rusted at the joints, one of the wheels wobbled, and the leather seat had been patched so many times it looked more like a map of scars than a surface to sit on. People walked by him without slowing down, as if his presence was as ordinary as the cracked sidewalk. He didn't beg, didn't wave for help, didn't try to draw attention. He simply sat there, his eyes hidden under the shadow of a flat cap, his face calm but unreadable. The young man slowed, down as he passed, his eyes catching on the wheel that barely turned. Something about the struggle in that simple motion, a man having to push harder for the chair to move even an inch, pulled him out of his rush. He stopped, glanced back once, then stepped closer. To anyone else, it looked like an act of kindness. Nothing more. A stranger offering help to someone who needed it. Yet there was something heavier in the air, something that couldn't be seen, only felt, the sense that this small gesture was the start of something much larger. Before that moment, both lives had been moving in very different directions. The young man's world was made up of long shifts at a repair shop, grease under his nails, and the weight of bills that never seemed to stop piling up. He was no stranger to struggle, though he carried it with quiet endurance, never letting bitterness show. For him, life was about making it through, one day at a time. The old man's life, on the other hand, seemed to exist in another world entirely, one built on years of privilege and control. To anyone who knew him by name, he wasn't just another old man in a wheelchair. He was a figure whose choices had once shaped the lives of thousands. But here, stripped of recognition, he was invisible. It's strange how often the world hides truth in plain sight. People believe they know what power looks like. Tailored suits, polished shoes, cars with tinted windows. They don't picture power sitting alone on a street corner, wrapped in silence and a worn coat. The old man had spent years perfecting the art of being unseen when he wanted to be, of masking strength behind weakness. He had learned that when people underestimate you, they reveal their truest selves. The young man didn't see any of this. What he saw was a wheel that needed fixing, a chair that could be made to move smoothly, a problem he knew he could solve. That was his gift, the way his hands understood machines, the way broken things seemed to speak to him, asking for repair. He crouched beside the chair, his fingers brushing over the bent spokes, the loose bolt, the grime clinging to the axle. His voice was gentle when he finally spoke, as if he didn't want to startle the man. "You're having trouble with this, aren't you? I can take a look if you want." The old man studied him for a long moment. His eyes, when they lifted from the shadow of his cap, were sharp, far too sharp for someone most would dismiss as frail. There was no smile, no gratitude in his expression, only curiosity, a calculating interest. Then he gave a small nod, the kind that didn't give away much, but was enough to grant permission. So the young man began to work, pulling a small multi-tool from his pocket, tightening bolts, adjusting the crooked wheel. He worked with focus, not out of pity but out of habit, the same way he would have worked on a bike chain or a customer's broken engine part. People passed by without noticing, as if this act of kindness was just another piece of background noise in the city's constant rhythm. But to the two men bound in that moment, it was far more than that. Neither of them could see what lay ahead, the nights filled with secrets, the questions of trust, the thin line between generosity and manipulation. They couldn't know how this single act would unravel into something much darker, pulling them both into a web where morality blurred and kindness itself could become a weapon. For now, it was only the beginning. A kind young man, an old man in a chair, and a broken wheel that brought them together on a grey morning in a city that never stopped watching. The rain had cleared by the time the young man tightened the last bolt on the wheelchair, but the clouds still pressed low, their shadows stretching across the streets like a warning. He stood, brushed the dirt from his hands, and gave the chair a gentle push to test the wheel. It moved smoothly now, gliding without resistance. The old man didn't thank him. He didn't even smile. He simply looked at him with those sharp eyes, and for reasons the young man couldn't explain, it made his chest tighten. "You've got good hands," the old man finally said, his voice dry, measured, as though he had weighed every word before letting it out. "What's your name?" The young man hesitated. "Daniel," he said simply. That was all it took. Their lives, once running on separate paths, began to twist together from that moment. The old man asked nothing more, but a week later, Daniel found himself standing in front of a gated mansion he never would have imagined entering. He had received a call from a voice that spoke with clipped authority, inviting him to come by. "The gentleman you helped would like to see you again." The mansion was unlike anything Daniel had ever known. Towering gates, marble pillars, windows so wide they reflected the whole of the garden outside. It was the kind of place that made you aware of every flaw in your shoes, every crease in your jacket, every bit of dirt under your nails. And yet the old man greeted him as though Daniel were expected, sitting in his chair in a room that smelled faintly of cigars and polished wood. What started as simple visits, Daniel checking on the chair, tightening screws, making adjustments, slowly became something else. The old man began to talk, though never carelessly. He told stories of businesses built and broken, of deals made in silence over glasses of whiskey, of betrayals that destroyed men who had thought themselves untouchable. Daniel listened, caught between fascination and unease. There was something magnetic about the old man, something that pulled him in even as a part of him wanted to step back. The old man never revealed the full truth of who he was, not at first. He let Daniel see only fragments, the bookshelves lined with rare editions, the paintings that whispered of wealth, the men in suits who came and went at odd hours. But beneath all of it, Daniel felt a pressure building, as though he were being drawn into a world he wasn't meant to touch. That pressure only grew as the weeks passed. Daniel's own life was fraying, rent overdue, his mother's medical bills stackies, young hire, the repair shop cutting his hours. He worked himself to exhaustion, yet it was never enough. And when the old man offered him money, "For your time, for your skill," Daniel refused at first. Pride was stitched into him, the belief that accepting charity made him less. But pride didn't pay bills, and desperation has a way of softening even the strongest resolve. Eventually, he took the envelope, his hands trembling as he slipped it into his jacket. It should have been a relief, but instead, it was the beginning of a silent contract. The old man noticed the hesitation, the crack in Daniel's armor, and he pressed against it, slowly, carefully. Each visit became less about the chair and more about conversations that felt like tests. The old man would ask questions, subtle at first, about loyalty, about trust, about what Daniel thought of people who abandoned their families, or people who betrayed those who helped them. His tone was never direct, but the weight behind his eyes made Daniel feel cornered, like every answer was being measured. Daniel didn't realize it then, but he was being pulled into a game far larger than himself. The old man's wealth wasn't just money. It was influence, power that seeped into everything he touched. Men came to the house late at night, leaving with pale faces and clenched jaws. Daniel overheard fragments of conversations, words like contracts, debt, and control. He didn't want to understand, but once you glimpse behind the curtain, it's impossible to unsee. The tension between them deepened one evening when Daniel mentioned his mother's illness. The old man leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "You're wasting your time with that shop. A man like you shouldn't be under cars all day. You should be learning how to move pieces on the board." "I don't want any part of that," Daniel said quickly. The old man's lips curled in the faintest smile. "You say that now." Those words stuck with him, echoing in his head during sleepless nights. And with every passing day, Daniel noticed how his visits seemed to change him. He was quicker to anger at the shop, more restless, more distracted. He found himself thinking of the mansion when he was supposed to be fixing engines, hearing the old man's voice in his head when he made choices. The world outside didn't help. Friends he thought he could rely on began to drift away, some jealous of the money he now had, others uneasy about the company he kept. His landlord cornered him for late payments. His boss warned him about missed hours. Even his younger sister, usually his source of comfort, questioned why he spent so much time at that mansion. "He's not your family," she said. "Why do you care so much about him?" Daniel didn't have an answer. He only knew that every time he tried to pull away, the old man seemed to draw him back in with the promise of something he couldn't name. Security, respect, a sense of belonging he had never truly known. Yet beneath the surface, darker things stirred. The old man's fortune was not clean. It had been built on ruthless choices, the kind that left broken people in their wake. And though Daniel didn't know the details, he felt it in the air around him, like the faint smell of smoke that lingers long after a fire. The first crack came during a dinner at the mansion. Daniel sat across from the old man and one of his associates, a sharp-suited man with eyes like steel. They spoke of business in vague terms, but when the associate glanced at Daniel and said, "Is this the boy you've been grooming?" Daniel felt a chill run through him. Grooming. The word clung to him, ugly, heavy, impossible to shake. He excused himself early that night, but the damage was done. Doubt sank its teeth into him. Was he just a tool? Another piece to be moved around the board? Or was he something more to the old man? Someone who reminded him of what he'd lost, someone he saw potential in. That doubt mixed with guilt, jealousy, and a growing sense of dependency. Daniel wanted to believe he was in control, but the truth was, he wasn't. The old man had found his weakness and wrapped chains around it, hidden in the form of kindness and opportunity. The nights grew heavier, filled with unease. Daniel began having dreams, of the chair rolling endlessly down dark hallways, of the old man's voice whispering from behind closed doors, of money slipping through his hands like water. He woke sweating, unsure of where he was headed, but certain he couldn't stop now. And so the tension built, unseen but unstoppable, like a storm swelling far out at sea. The young man, once kind and steady, was now caught between worlds, one of survival and one of corruption, one of loyalty and one of betrayal. The old man, who had lived his life pulling strings, had found in Daniel something unexpected, not just usefulness, but a reflection of his own youth, a chance to mold another life into the shape he wanted. Neither would admit it, but they were bound now by more than a broken wheel. They were bound by power, need, and the dangerous truth that kindness, once twisted, could become the very thing that destroyed them both. The night it happened The mansion seemed heavier than usual, the air inside pressing down as though it knew something terrible was about to take place. Rain struck the windows in steady bursts, the kind that muffled sound and made the world outside disappear. The lamps cast long shadows across the hall, and the silence between Daniel and the old man had grown so sharp it felt like glass, ready to shatter with the smallest touch. Daniel had been called there again, summoned late with a voice on the phone that left no room for refusal. He arrived tense, his stomach knotted, his hands shaking, though he tried to steady them in his pockets. He told himself he was only coming to check on the chair again, maybe to sit for a drink and then leave. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the truth anymore. Every visit had turned into a test, and tonight, the test had reached its breaking point. The old man sat in his usual place by the fire, a glass of dark liquor in one hand, the wheelchair still gleaming from Daniel's careful repairs. His eyes followed Daniel's every move, watching him cross the room like prey stepping into a trap. "You've been restless," he said, his voice slow, measured. "I can see it in your face. You're torn between running back to that small life of yours and staying here, where you belong." "I don't belong here," Daniel snapped, louder than he meant to. His voice cracked, filled with weeks of pressure and sleepless nights. "I never asked for any of this. You keep pulling me in, and I don't know what the hell you want from me." The old man didn't flinch. He swirled the glass in his hand and said quietly, "I want to know who you are when it matters. Because everyone shows their true self when the weight is too much. Are you strong, Daniel? Or are you just another coward who runs when things get hard?" The words hit harder than any scream could have. They weren't loud, but they were cutting, slicing into Daniel's doubts and pride. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. His hands curled into fists. He thought of his mother's hospital bills, his sister's worried face, and the constant feeling of drowning no matter how hard he worked. And then he thought of the way the old man looked at him, not with kindness, but with ownership, like he was just another piece on the board. "I'm not your project," Daniel said through clenched teeth. The old man smiled faintly, a cruel curve of the lips. "You're more mine than you realize." The room seemed to shrink around them. The storm outside roared louder, rattling the glass. Daniel felt heat rising in his chest, his breath coming faster. He took a step forward, then another, until he stood over the chair. The old man didn't move, didn't show fear. If anything, his eyes gleamed with something that looked like satisfaction, as though this was exactly what he'd wanted. "Do it," he whispered. "Show me." The moment snapped. Daniel's hands went to the arms of the chair, shaking it hard enough to jolt the old man against the leather seat. "Stop playing with me!" he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of everything boiling inside. But the old man only laughed, a dry, rattling sound that made Daniel's skin crawl. That laugh broke him. Something inside Daniel twisted loose, something he had been fighting for weeks, and before he could think, before he could stop himself, he pushed the chair back with all his strength. The wheels rolled violently toward the edge of the polished floor, where they dipped down into the sunken part of the living room. The chair struck the step, tilted, and then toppled. The sound was sickening, the crack of glass shattering from the drink, the heavy thud of a body hitting marble, the sharp metallic clang of the chair landing on its side. For a moment the room went silent except for the storm outside. Daniel stood frozen, his chest heaving, his ears ringing. The old man lay twisted on the floor, his head at an unnatural angle, his eyes open but unblinking. Blood seeped slowly from where it had struck the edge of the step, a dark pool spreading across the white stone. The wheelchair lay beside him, one wheel spinning uselessly, squeaking in uneven circles. Daniel's breath came in short gasps. His hands trembled as he pressed them against his face, smearing sweat across his skin. He hadn't meant for it to go this far. He had only wanted to scare him, to make him stop. But the sight before him was undeniable. The old man was motionless, silent, gone. For a long moment, Daniel stood there in shock, his body locked in place, his mind refusing to process what had just happened. Then panic struck. His thoughts raced in fragments. He's dead. What have I done? They'll know it was me. They'll think I planned this. I need to leave. I can't leave. What do I do? He dropped to his knees beside the old man, shaking his shoulder, whispering, "Get up, please. Just get up." But the body didn't respond. The weight of it was too real, too final. Daniel pulled back, his face pale, his heart crashing against his ribs. The house seemed to close in on him. The shadows lengthened, the fire hissed in the hearth, and the storm outside roared louder than ever. He felt the walls watching him, the silence accusing him. He staggered to his feet, running his hands through his hair, pacing the room. His mind scrambled for a way out, for some explanation he could give, some lie that might make sense of what had just happened. But there was no lie big enough to cover this. He knew the men who worked for the old man would find out. He knew the name the old man carried, the weight of it, the reach it had. Killing him, even by accident, wasn't just a crime. It was a death sentence. Daniel sank into one of the leather chairs, his body shaking uncontrollably. He could still hear the old man's voice in his head. "Show me." He realized with a cold chill that this was what the old man had wanted all along. Not to live, but to see how far Daniel would go. And now, in one violent instant, Daniel had crossed a line he could never return from. The aftermath came fast. He stumbled into the kitchen, grabbed a rag, tried to wipe the blood from the marble, but it smeared darker, spreading instead of vanishing. He pulled the chair upright, his fingers slick with red, then froze when he saw how unnatural the body still looked. No one would believe this was an accident. No one would believe he hadn't meant it. The storm outside swallowed the city in darkness, and inside the mansion, Daniel's panic built into something close to madness. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. Every shadow looked like a figure watching him. He felt trapped, hunted already, though no one else knew what had happened yet. When he finally forced himself to leave, his legs moved like they belonged to someone else, dragging him toward the door. He stepped out into the rain, the cold drops soaking his hair, mixing with the sweat on his face. His clothes clung to him, heavy with the weight of what he had done. Behind him, the mansion loomed like a grave, holding the body of the man who had pulled him into this twisted world and dared him to prove himself. Ahead of him lay the city, vast and merciless, where every light seemed to flicker with suspicion. Daniel walked into it, his heart hammering, knowing that his life, once ordinary, wry and kind, had just been rewritten in blood. The days after the night in the mansion blurred together for Daniel, though each one left a new scar on his mind. He woke drenched in sweat, convinced someone was at his door. Every knock, every phone call, every shadow stretching across the street made his pulse surge with terror. He told himself it had been an accident, whispered the words in the dark when no one else could hear, but no amount of repetition erased the truth. He had pushed. He had watched the chair tip. He had stood frozen as the old man's body lay broken on the marble floor. At first, denial was all he had. He returned to the repair shop, tried to pick up a wrench with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and tried to force himself into the rhythm of ordinary life. But the weight of the crime followed him into every moment. Customers' faces seemed sharper, suspicious. His boss's questions about his lateness felt like accusations. Even his sister noticed the change, asking why he jumped every time the phone rang. Daniel brushed her off with weak excuses, but the walls around him were closing in. When the news broke, it spread faster than fire. "Local billionaire found dead in mansion," the headlines read, splashed across every screen and newspaper. The details were vague at first. A fall, possibly an accident. Reporters gathered outside the gates, cameras flashing, voices overlapping. But soon the questions began, the speculation piling higher with every passing hour. Who had been with him that night? Why were there signs of a struggle? Why had a man so powerful, so careful, ended up dead on the cold floor of his own home? The world Daniel had stepped into by chance was now staring back at him with hungry eyes. The old man's name was one that carried weight in business, in politics, in whispered conversations about money that moved in the shadows. His death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a shockwave. Associates demanded answers, rivals smirked in public, but schemed in private, and the community whispered stories that grew darker with each retelling. For Daniel, guilt became a living thing. It crept into his dreams, twisting them into endless replayings of the moment. Sometimes the old man laughed as he fell. Sometimes he reached out for Daniel's hand, his eyes pleading. Sometimes he rose from the floor, blood running down his face, whispering, "Show me again." Daniel woke gasping, his throat tight, his chest heavy. The guilt didn't leave him when the sun rose. It colored everything. The way he looked at his sister, the way he avoided his mother's hospital room, the way he couldn't stand the sound of his own voice when he tried to explain himself, even in silence. The community, once indifferent to the old man, now remembered him as a titan. People who had never spoken to him called him a visionary. Others, who had once cursed his name, suddenly softened their words in death. The contrast between public praise and private fear painted him in shades Daniel couldn't reconcile. He had known a different man, cold, manipulative, dangerous in ways no headline could capture. But that truth was swallowed by the narrative the world wanted, a great man cut down too soon. Investigations began, quietly at first, but growing louder. Detectives asked questions Daniel knew would circle back to him. He had been seen at the mansion more than once. Neighbors had noticed the young man in plain clothes slipping past the gates. Someone had overheard arguments. Each fragment formed a picture Daniel couldn't escape. His sister noticed his decline before anyone else. "What's going on with you?" she asked one night, her eyes wide with worry. "You're not sleeping. You barely eat, and you keep looking over your shoulder like someone's after you. Just tell me what's wrong." Daniel wanted to tell her. The words swelled in his throat, burning for release. But every time he imagined her face if she knew the truth, shame clamped his mouth shut. So he lied, and the lie dug deeper into him, another chain he couldn't break. As the weeks passed, Daniel's world fractured. The repair shop let him go, citing performance issues. Friends who once laughed with him now avoided him, uncomfortable with the whispers tying him to the mansion. Even his mother, frail in her hospital bed, asked softly, "Why do they keep saying your name on the news?" Daniel smiled through tears he couldn't explain, brushing her hair from her face as though he could protect her from the weight of what he carried. The psychological toll grew unbearable. He caught himself rehearsing alibis in the mirror, inventing conversations where he convinced detectives of his innocence. He avoided certain streets, certain faces, as though guilt was branded on his forehead for everyone to see. His hands, once steady with tools, now shook too much to hold even a simple glass of water without spilling. Outside, the city gossiped. To some, Daniel was a loyal helper who had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. To others, he was a schemer who had wormed his way into the life of a wealthy man, waiting for the chance to strike. The contrast was unbearable. He wasn't a villain, he told himself. He wasn't a murderer. But then he saw the blood again, the way it had spread across the marble floor, and the truth tore into him all over again. In quiet moments, he tried to justify what had happened. He told himself the old man had pushed him, had manipulated him into that moment. He reminded himself that the words, "Do it, show me," had been whispered just before the fall. But justification crumbled under the weight of memory. No matter what the old man had said, it had been Daniel's hands on the chair. Daniel's anger had shoved it forward. Daniel's weakness had turned into violence. The ripple effect stretched far beyond him. Associates of the old man tightened their grip on his empire, carving it into pieces, fighting over what remained. The family, long estranged, came forward to mourn publicly, though whispers said they had only come for the inheritance. The media fed on the story endlessly, each new detail spinning more speculation. For the city, the crime became a spectacle. For Daniel, it was a prison with no walls. As winter deepened, Daniel felt himself unravel. He stopped answering his phone. He avoided his sister's eyes. He walked the streets at night, the cold cutting into his skin, almost welcoming the punishment. He thought of turning himself in, of confessing everything just to let it end. But each time, fear stopped him. The fear of prison, the fear of headlines, the fear of seeing his mother's face when she finally knew the truth. So he carried it alone. The guilt, the fear. The endless silence pressed against him harder than any interrogation ever could. And in that silence, he realized something he couldn't admit out loud. The old man hadn't just broken him in life. Even in death, he still controlled him. The story reaches its end, not with a sense of triumph, but with an uneasy silence. The courtroom proceedings, the media frenzy, and the whispered conversations in living rooms across the country eventually gave way to verdicts, sentences, and carefully worded statements from lawyers and judges. But behind the legal resolutions lingered wounds far deeper than any punishment could heal. Justice was delivered in the technical sense, trials concluded, penalties imposed, but the lives of everyone entangled in this case were irrevocably altered. For the victim's family, the verdict offered neither closure nor comfort. They had longed for answers, for some explanation that could make sense of the violence, but the truth, layered in obsession, betrayal, and hidden resentments, only deepened their grief. Each court session forced them to relive their loss, and while the guilty were held accountable, the victim's absence was a permanent scar. Birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries became quiet reminders of a life that should have been lived. For the perpetrators, the legal consequences were harsh and inevitable. Some faced long prison terms, stripped of the very freedoms they once took for granted. Others, though not directly responsible for the act itself, found themselves bearing the weight of complicity, sentences lighter in years but heavy in lifelong stigma. Even those who avoided prison could not avoid judgment. Employers distanced themselves, neighbors turned cold, and former friends vanished into silence. Their names, once ordinary, became synonymous with tragedy. Was justice served? On paper, perhaps. The law had spoken, yet the community debated whether the punishments fit the crime. For some, the sentences seemed merciful, given the brutality of the act. For others, they were insufficient, a reminder that no earthly system could balance the scales between life taken and life lost. The complexity of justice lingered like a shadow. Punishment may address legality, but morality and healing remained far more elusive. The broader societal impact was unmistakable. What began as a private conflict had grown into a national spectacle, a crime dissected in headlines, talk shows, and endless online debates. Communities questioned their own safety, neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, and institutions, schools, churches, workplaces, were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the fragility of trust. The media played its usual role, amplifying every detail, blurring the line between public interest and exploitation. Documentaries and articles dissected the motivations, portraying the key players as villains, victims, or tragic figures depending on the narrative angle. For the families involved, this constant exposure was another form of punishment. Grief became public property, their private lives turned into cautionary tales. Yet, amid the sensationalism, the case also sparked serious dialogue. It shed light on the societal pressures that often remain hidden until they explode into tragedy. Financial struggles, suffocating expectations, unspoken abuse, and toxic power dynamics. Lawmakers and community leaders spoke of reform, whether through stricter protections for vulnerable individuals, expanded mental health resources, or campaigns raising awareness about warning signs of manipulation and obsession. While these measures could not undo the past, they carried the hope of preventing future tragedies. At its core, this case forced an uncomfortable reckoning with human nature. The crime was not an act committed by faceless strangers, but by people once considered ordinary. Family members, partners, colleagues, neighbors. This reality unsettled many because it blurred the lines between them and us. It was a chilling reminder that under the right conditions, stress, obsession, anger, anyone might be capable of crossing moral boundaries they once thought unbreakable. The moral compass. Lexities were stark. Good people made terrible choices. Ordinary frustrations metastasized into destructive actions. Jealousy, secrecy, and a hunger for control collided in ways that no one could fully anticipate. The case illustrated how morality is not a fixed compass, but a fragile system, vulnerable to rationalization and self-deception. Every step that led to the crime was justified, in someone's mind, as necessary or deserved. Only in hindsight did the cumulative weight of those decisions reveal itself as catastrophic. Power dynamics played an equally significant role. Whether through financial leverage, emotional manipulation, or societal standing, one party sought to control another, creating an imbalance that fueled tension and resentment. The crime was not only an act of violence but also an expression of dominance, an attempt to reclaim power or enforce it through irreversible means. Yet the moment the crime was committed, that illusion of control collapsed. The perpetrator lost everything: freedom, reputation, and the very relationships they had once fought so desperately to manipulate. What remains most haunting is the complexity of human motivations. No single trigger caused this tragedy. Instead, it was a chain reaction. One small grievance left unresolved. One secret buried. One moment of weakness compounded over time until the pressure became unbearable. This layered reality resists easy explanations. It forces us to acknowledge that human beings are driven by forces both visible and hidden, rational and irrational, and that these forces can sometimes converge in terrifying ways. In the end, the legacy of the case rests not only in court documents, but in memory. The victim is remembered by loved ones for the life they lived, not the way they died. Communities recall the lessons, the importance of speaking up, of paying attention to warning signs, of recognizing how quickly silence can turn dangerous. The perpetrators, meanwhile, carry their legacy in infamy, forever defined by their darkest actions, their lives serving as a warning of what unchecked emotions and secrecy can destroy. Justice in this story feels less like a resolution and more like an uneasy balance between accountability and tragedy. The law imposed order, but it could not restore what was lost. What lingers is reflection on the fragility of human relationships, on the corrosive nature of unspoken resentments, and on the profound consequences of ignoring warning signs. This crime is more than a singular event. It is a mirror, a reflection of society's vulnerabilities, of the cracks within human relationships, of the way power, secrecy, and morality intertwine. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that justice is imperfect, that morality is fragile, and that within the human heart lies both the capacity for love and the potential for ruin. And so the story closes, not with finality, but with contemplation. The courtroom may be silent now, the headlines faded, the public fascination turning to the next tragedy. But for those who lived it, for families shattered, for communities scarred, for lives forever altered, the echoes remain. This case becomes a cautionary tale, a reminder of the thin line between order and chaos, and a call to remain vigilant against the darker impulses that dwell within us all.